we start with leadership. So have you gotten better as a leader of your career, or like how do you find out, right? So um so
Good
as
question, Mike.
How do you even know?
I don't
yeah.
know. I mean,
Yeah.
gosh, you always hope that you get better at things over time, right? Heaven forbid that you're set in stone at the beginning of your career and you end your career basically with the same skills, attributes, and you haven't actually progressed. That's terrible. I never wanted to be one of those people. So from a very early age again, and I spoke about that, experience of BP being exposed to very senior people, including the CEO. I would observe all of those senior leaders. I would look at the way that they interacted with people. I remember one guy at BP, he was super charismatic, a general manager of retail. So that's a direct report to the CEO back in the day, Bob Constantine. And Bob was really affable, naturally a connector. He could stand on stage in front of 1,200 people and point to somebody and say, Dan, you know what I'm talking about. And everyone in the audience just leaned in. They really felt like he knew them. And he would. And he had all these great techniques. And I was lucky enough that I would go to events with this guy and see him in action. So I learned from that. I observed, I learned. And then as I got the opportunity, as I was starting to lead teams and, leading projects, I would try out some of those techniques. And I just try and work out what fit for me, then reflect on how it was working. I think one of the things I worked out very early in my career is that I'm a very poor impersonation of somebody else, right? And I think in my 20s, what I tried to do was I tried to wear the three-piece suits with big shoulder pads, back in the 90s, lots of gold buttons. Oh. I tried to behave more like some of the role models that I'd seen some of those leaders and do that. But it wasn't authentically me. So I had to reflect and think about how do I adjust that, look at some of those really good practices of what I think is awesome in a leader and incorporate that into my own style. So that's the thing I did, was observe, learn, reflect, and then just keep repeating until I got better at it. So, no one, I think I would never say that I'm perfect, and I've never met a perfect leader. And I think the pursuit of perfection is actually a pointless exercise. This is why I love this concept of just lifelong and constant learning. We all have bad days. We all trip ourselves up. And even some of the greatest leaders that I've worked with have had bad days. And I think one of the things that I've been lucky enough to do and to see and to witness is both the good and the bad of some of these leaders, and then how they've recovered from those not so good days. What did they do next? And so I've always endeavored to do kind of the same thing. If I'm not having a great day or a great week, I'll reach out, I'll try and get advice from other people, or I'll just pause, slow it all down for a little while, reflect again, and then try and re-engage. So it's that thing, I think, you never want to leave some things unsaid, right? Particularly when we're talking as a leader, you sometimes step into quite emotional and quite difficult conversations. And I think part of being a leader is actually being open to those, to not have judgments, to be prepared to listen, and moreover, be prepared to actually have your mind changed. That's what you've got to do if you really want to be a great leader. Yeah, don't be set in stone. As I said, don't start in stone at the beginning of your career and end up the same way. The whole thing, I've always described it, and I think, Dan, you've heard me describe this before. You can take different paths up the same mountain, right? Some people will decide to take the path which is a straight line path. I want to get promoted and promoted and promoted, and I'm going to get to the top as quickly as possible. I didn't choose that path. I've always chosen the path most interesting. So as I'm climbing the mountain, I kind of stop for a while and think, hey, it's pretty nice here. Maybe I'll do this gig for a while. And then after that, I'll think about which is the path. Am I going to go left or right? Which one of these things is more interesting to me? Because the journey for me is as important as the destination. And I get exposed to so many people and so many opportunities and so many new things like technology and products and services that it's just fascinating and engaging and interesting as you travel that kind of windy path. I just love it. So that's kind of how I've navigated, Michael, the whole leadership journey, right? Take path most interesting, observe where you think people are doing leadership, I think, really well, and then try and incorporate what just feels right for you.
Great. That's a really good license. Yeah, and also I can imagine that, during the journey of your career, there might be some challenges, key challenges, or uh that make you learn a lot
Yep.
and also maybe like feel pretty it's kind of like a reset, right? And then, like, do you have any experiences or stories that you might share on that, and how do you overcome those challenges uh
Yeah.
during your career? Yeah.
Look, lots of different ones. I mean, and some are quite small, and then some are quite, I think, game changing. So if I think about a small experience in terms of not necessarily being the most senior person in the room, but actually having the ability to do situational leadership. So I remember many years ago, I was at Telstra and we were running an event, and it was game changing because we'd actually rolled out an IP network to this hotel. We had the Cisco telepresence units on stage, which was a pretty big deal. Very difficult to run that kind of technology outside of an office because we wanted to demonstrate it.
Mm.
So there was a hold up. The event wasn't starting, and I went backstage to find out why, and they couldn't get the machines working. So the connection had failed, right? What they were going to have was 2 screens on stage and have a facilitated conversation. So, one screen would turn up, one leader, the second one would turn up. They'd tried everything. They'd unplugged all the boards. Everybody was running around. There was, directors and all kinds of senior people. And I had a very senior, actually the director of the state, saying, "We just have to start, Leonie." He was demanding that we start because we were holding the customers up. And I said very politely and very calmly, "Just give me a second." Right? So I went and had a chat to everybody. I listened to what they'd already tried. And I paused for a second and I said, "What happens if we just use one of these machines?" And I said, "What do you mean?" I said, "What happens if we don't have both people on stage at the same time, but we just use one and you can bring those people up individually?" And they said, "Oh, actually, we can do that." Right? So that's what we did. Now, was it exactly the experience that we had designed for this particular event to prove to our customers that that technology was going to work for them? No. But did they know any different? Because it was the only time that they were seeing that event. They didn't. So we still got fantastic scores from the event. The technology was able to be demonstrated, and nobody really realized that the second screen was supposed to have something on it. So I think it's one of those things in terms of, even if you don't have the authority and the title that says you're a leader, I think in these very challenging, very emotionally charged situations, you can show up as a leader in those situations by keeping calm, again, listening, understanding what everything else has been done, and then just pausing for a second to see if there's another opportunity. So that's what I did. I think the second example I give is, when we had quite a lot of interesting challenges, I think, in the Hong Kong market. We first had the protest movement, and then we had pandemic start quite early after it started in China. So one of the things we had to do was actually think about how do we first and foremost protect our team, right? The number one thing as a leader, and I think your responsibility, yes, we have a responsibility to our customers. The customers always come first. But the next thing is always this responsibility, and in equal measures, to your team. So understanding the safety and security of the team was really important. And then setting up practices around incident response, crisis management, just making sure that everybody really kept calm and got through those situations was really important. And then one of the things, I won't go into a lot of detail because it was a very long story, but I think you also have to keep a sense of humour, because these situations, and we've just all lived through 3 years of COVID, can be quite draining. And I'm somebody, whilst I don't take myself particularly seriously, I take what I do very seriously. And so injecting a little bit of humor and a little bit of humanity into these situations that can seem quite dark is really important. So we had T-shirts printed in different Google colors when I was the managing director of Google Hong Kong. And they just said, keep calm and eat gale yu dan, which is curried fish balls, right? And it's a local Hong Kong delicacy that I love. And, you know, a lot of my team members thought that was quite funny. But it was just a nice little reminder to us that, like all of these things, no matter how long it took to get out of this situation, which at the time was COVID-19, the pandemic, we just had to be calm about it, because a lot of these situations you can only worry about what you can control. And when you think about what you can control, a lot of it just comes back to you as an individual, right?
Right.
I can work hard on controlling my health, what I eat, how I exercise, right? I can't always control my reactions, but I can control what I do next. So really thinking about that patience and that calm and trying to be quite zen was super important. So I think those are probably the two examples that I'd use, Mike. You know, one pretty simple in terms of an event, what you actually do in that situation, and the other one at a market level and a country level, quite complicated in terms of what it was actually going on in the globe. And then how do you actually think about being a little bit selfless and focusing very much on the health and well-being of your team. Yeah.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. And also, like, maybe we can start talk about technology and also government.
Mm-hmm.
And since you have like extensive experience in, and the first question is that what were some of your best and toughest experiences, like bringing technology and government together?
Yep.
So yeah.
So I think again, like all partners for businesses, the government should be viewed basically as a partner to business. I think a lot of government agencies and you know, politicians, regulators, bureaucrats, they do actually want to lean in and learn from tech companies. They're curious about the technologies. Sure, they have concerns, and it's justifiably so on behalf of their citizens, because that's their job, right? Their job is basically to look after the citizens and provide for them. So I think when you're working with government, it's always been a tricky one. I think in my early days of selling, I actually ended up selling more to corporates because I didn't really understand how I would deal with government. Like, you know, I spoke to some of, back 20 years ago, I spoke to some of the salespeople that dealt with government, and they couldn't even buy them a cup of coffee because it would be looked upon as, you know, doing a favor. So everybody paid for their own coffee. I thought, wow, really? You know, I was kind of used to shouting a coffee here or a lunch there, right, and doing all of those sorts of things, because that was, you know, my 90s, 2010s experience. But one of the things with dealing with government, how do you actually work with the government, build relationships without it feeling like you're doing a hard sell or that there's some sort of compliance or governance risk? So one of the things that's actually worked quite well, and I learned this from my time at Telstra, my boss at the time, Christian Turk, and his peers actually conceived of a Telstra productivity indicator. It was a thought leadership program which looked at particular industry verticals, it looked at productivity overall for Australia, and it was a fantastic annual piece of research, which was very, very useful. The government picked it up, right? And our companies picked it up, our partners picked it up, the clients picked it up, and they used that information inside their own organisations to help them drive productivity outcomes. I thought that that was a great piece of work. So when I became managing director for Google Hong Kong, I wanted a similar piece of work around thought leadership. And that's where we came up with Smarter Digital City. It was conceived in 2016, and we released the first report in 2017. And that looked at smarter retail, smarter travel, smarter finance, and then smarter living as concepts within Hong Kong. We worked really collaboratively with the government. So David Chung, who was from the Information Technology Bureau, was one of the people that we consulted to say, hey, we're thinking about doing this. What do you think? What are the sorts of things that you think the IT Bureau and the government would be interested to know? So they actually helped us to design the questionnaire. Right? We spoke to clients, we spoke to government agencies, we spoke to the Science and Technology Park before we even started the work. Because what I didn't want to assume is that we knew everything. Right? I didn't want to assume that the question set that we would be able to create in isolation as Google was going to be the question set that our government agencies and our client partners and our third-party partners who help us to implement, were they the questions that they actually wanted to ask in a very large, very scaled piece of novel research. So that the instrument was shared, right? And then the outcomes and the outputs were shared as well. So as we went through the process of drafting up the final report, we got all of the data back from these interviews, like 1,000 plus interviews across Hong Kong, and we covered, enterprise, small business, consumer. We then went and checked in with our key thought leadership partners, so our key advisors and influencers. So senior officials in government, senior thought leaders in digital technology, and then our senior client partners as well. Got their feedback and just honed that into a really useful report, which we then launched every year with a major event. And it was quite rewarding. As I was leaving Hong Kong, some of the clients actually said that they had all 4 hard copies of the reports that we'd produced and that I'd co-authored, and they kept them on their desk as a resource. And I think that's truly an amazing example of a technology company working really well, not just with government, but also with their clients, to build something that's useful for them. It's not about necessarily selling a product. There'll be a consequence. There'll be a halo effect, obviously, for the organization, but that was not the intent. The intent was to answer a really simple question: how can Hong Kong be a smarter digital city? And if you pose that question to different people, it meant different things. Then you'd have to bring those inputs in and really create something that everybody really felt like they had ownership of. And I think that was fantastic. So, again, as I was leaving Hong Kong in late 2020, I met with a lot of these stakeholders before I left, and we've still got great relationships to this day on the basis of doing that work together.
What were some of your favorite insights, or maybe things that you called out in 2016, 2017 and actually started coming to fruition?
I think what was interesting was probably the demographic, right? So there was always an assumption in Hong Kong, particularly for the elderly, and it's quite funny because in Hong Kong, the elderly is considered over 55, and I'm approaching that age in my 50s. So as a digital native, I don't find 55 particularly old, but there's all these preconceived ideas. So there were 2 ideas or myths that I really wanted to debunk. One was that Hong Kongers don't like to shop online. And 2 was that there was no way that the elderly were really going to embrace digital technologies. And I just fundamentally disagreed with both, because Hong Kong at the time had one of the highest penetrations of mobile technology, right? So for every Hong Konger, there's about 2.5 SIM cards. If you took the taxi drivers that had 5 phones on out, sure, the number comes down a little bit, but basically there is a smartphone in the hands of almost every citizen within Hong Kong. Now, whether they were using them just for checking messages or whether they were actually using them for internet access, right, we didn't know. What ended up coming out of that research over the 4 years that I was working on that program, it started out that, of course, the young were very engaged and had a very high digital engagement score, and that the older were less so. But what was really interesting, the movement, so the young over the 4 years stayed very engaged, as you would expect them to. But one of the biggest changes was in the 40 plus category and the 55 category in terms of their relative digital adoption went up. The ones in the middle, which were pretty much of that generation born after, what am I? I guess am I Gen X? I can't remember which one I'm supposed to be. But the generation who are sort of in their 30s and, probably having kids, etc., that generation didn't change so much, because I think the competing demands of life and family, etc., meant that they sort of just stayed the same. But what was happening for people who were a bit older, their banks were going online, right? All of their services were going online. So they had no choice but to learn how to do these things. And I think that really increased their digital adoption over time. And what it started to do was change the mindsets of marketers and business leaders about how they could build better applications, right? And better ways to serve and better ways to interact. So that was cool. The second point about, Hong Kong is not really loving online shopping, actually was true to a certain extent. I mean, I used to joke in Hong Kong that if shopping was an Olympic sport, Hong Kong would win gold every 4 years, because Hong Kongers just love to shop. They love being out in shopping malls, etc. So I think when we started the research, something like only 4% of Hong Kongers actually shopped regularly online. So of total retail purchases, about 4% were online. What we saw over the 4 years was an increase in online, but I think not just the purchasing of products, but the servicing of those products. That was what was really increasing. So the overall digital score increasing actually meant that people were interacting more with these large organizations through technology, mostly through their mobile phones, but also through, desktops and computers, because what they were finding was that was a faster path to getting them the solution that they wanted. Customers are always going to naturally choose the path that's right for them, right? The one that takes the less time and that gives them the best answer, the best result, the best product, the best service. That's what they're going to do. So I think that was what was really interesting about that research project, was looking at I love a longitudinal study. You can never do a big study like that just once. You've got to keep going.
Right.
So you start in 2017. When I left at the end of 2020, we had 4 years of research at that time. And you could really see how this, just in a very short space of time, this uptake of digital technologies was really quite huge, because it was having a lot of benefit for those individuals, for those individual customers and users. If it doesn't have benefit, right, build it and they will come. Sure, field of dreams, but they won't come and they won't interact and they won't engage unless it genuinely helps them. And that's what we were finding through the research, and it actually played out in all of the statistics as well. Yeah. Pretty cool. Obviously something I was a little passionate about, Dan and Mike.
Yeah. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And I think maybe kind of one last key question about that is, so now, I mean, over recent years, you've gotten involved in board and advisory roles. What, how do you think about finding and pursuing those kinds of opportunities, and what keeps you motivated to do that stuff outside of the kind of the day job?
Yeah. Again, because I'm naturally curious, and I do get, unfortunately, I do get bored quite quickly. So I like variety in what I'm doing. I also, in terms of the board work, joining my first board, probably, nearly 10 plus years ago, I joined a charity board. The variety of people around the table was really interesting to me. The different backgrounds, the different ways of thinking, their different experiences and what they brought to the table was very different to working in an organization either like Telstra or Google, right? Because I think there's organizations, they do have a certain sameness. They do have values alignment, and they have a particular thing that they do well. So, Telstra is a telco, Google is a technology company. So you do tend to have almost like a vertical way of thinking in those organizations based on the things that they produce, the people that they serve, and what they actually do. When you join a board, if you join the right board, that diversity of people having different experiences is quite amazing, because it ends up having different conversations about how to solve problems. So I might think about solving a problem a particular way, but one of my peers on the board might think completely differently based on their experience. Boards are very safe and respectful places to be able to have those discussions, and then to be able to try and, ask very good questions of the executive team of why does something work that way? How are we actually going to increase either fundraising, or the revenues, depending on whether it's not for profit or profit. And I really love that kind of, I think, not just an intellectual challenge, but also being able to collaborate with really smart people. And you find that, I think, on boards or as advisors to startups and other companies. So that's, I think it keeps me really interested, and it keeps both my mind and my skills sharp, right? Because you know, as you know, I got a lot of energy. I like to feel like I'm really contributing. And so again, you know, your earlier question about which ones do you actually choose and how do you actually choose board or advisory roles? Well,
Right.
First and foremost, you need to be aligned to the mission, vision and values of that organisation. It needs to be somewhere where you think that your skills, experience and capabilities can actually add some value. But I think also what's really important is that chemistry between yourself, the chair, and the other board members and executives. You really want a lot of those things to work, because again, a lot of this stuff, it really does boil down to trust, right? If you have those relationships and you can build trust, you can then bring your best self to the table in terms of actually wanting to make a positive difference to that organisation. That's how I kind of think about it all. It's like a reverse interview process in some respects. I just want to make sure that I'm the right fit, because you know, the way that I am, I'm pretty happy with where I've ended up and you know, how I show up these days. But my particular skill set, my approach may not be for everybody. So you actually have to have those conversations to make sure that you'll be the right fit, and that you can also, I think, be able to speak your mind quite freely, and then have those ideas with your collaborators come to life, because then that becomes quite rewarding. Again, back to that point of, you don't want to be set in stone and standing still. You want to be thinking about how do you constructively challenge to bring benefit and make things better.
Yeah. And I can see, you know, from your description, how it kind of adds this whole new dimension to working life. And it makes me wonder, you know, coming full circle, the first question, you know, you mentioned your mom, and she wasn't, you know, when she wasn't doing kind of full-time work anymore, she found kind of avenues for learning and growth and contribution through board work and charity work. And so I guess that having that role model, maybe, does that play a part into kind of how you think about these things?
I think it probably does. Yeah, it really does. I mean, you know, one of the things I've always tried to instill in my own children is to say to them, you know, what are you going to do to make a difference to the world, right? I don't really mind what it is that you do with your career. You know, and I joke, life is long and mostly boring, so you really need to do what you love. You know, when you're little kids, you haven't got kids yet, Dan, have you?
No, not yet.
When you have them, Michael, have you got children?
No, not yet.
When you have kids, whatever language is your language that you speak at home, the number one thing you're going to hear is, I'm bored. So what I used to always say to my kids is, yep, life is long and mostly boring, which is an important lesson in why you need to do things and spend time with people that you love. That's super important. So, you know, I look at that in all aspects of my work and my life and my friendships. I choose to spend time where I value and I am valued. Right? And it's a really lovely way to live. And I think, you know, there's plenty of organizations out there and plenty of companies and plenty of groups that you could join. But being, I think, very sure of yourself and actually knowing where you'll be able to show up and be your best is really important. And that's one of the things I think that, you know, I spend a bit of time working on, and just making sure that I'm within those groups where it will bring out the best in me. Now, that's cool. I have that here back in Melbourne with a lot of friendships.
That's wonderful.
And my golf game's getting much better here as well, by the way.
Oh, great. Well, is there any any kind of last things that you want to bring up or share with
Yeah.
our listeners? We're wrapping up.
Well, thanks very much to you and Michael for the opportunity. I think the only thing I'd say is my favorite quote of all time is Oscar Wilde: "Be yourself. Everyone else is already taken." Right? And I think that's what I've always endeavored to do. As I said before, I'm a poor impersonation of somebody else. So I basically spent my life and career just trying to be and bring my best self. And most of the time that works out, some days not so good. But the fortunate thing for me, I think, is that I'm surrounded by family and friends who care deeply. And when I trip and fall, they pick me up and help me keep going. And I think that's the most amazing thing. That for me is the mark of a life well lived. So, that's what I'd leave your audience with. Be yourself. Everyone else is already taken.
Beautiful. And Leonie, what's the best way for folks to follow you, hear what you're up to, keep in touch?
LinkedIn. So you can follow me on LinkedIn. That's LinkedIn is my favorite social media. That's where I tend to post most of my thoughts and what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, etc. Yeah. So follow me on LinkedIn. That'd be great.
All right. Yeah. +1. I think LinkedIn is underrated sometimes as a social media.
Yeah.
There's a lot of good stuff on there.
Yeah, there is. I spend a lot of my time reading on LinkedIn these days.
Yeah, there is. I mean, there is a lot of unnecessary self-promotion that you see a lot.
Yeah.
But you can mute things.
Right.
Yeah, you can always find the mute button. I should have worn my "You're on mute" T-shirt today, Dan. Maybe next time we catch up.
Maybe next time. Great. Well, our guest today has been Leonie Valentine. Leonie, thanks so much for being part of the craft.
Thank you. Thanks again.
And thank you all for listening to the Craft Podcast. For more links and information about this episode, you can look below if you're watching on YouTube, or you can search for the Craft Podcast on YouTube or anywhere you get your podcasts. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed this video and want to see more. Like I said before, you could win $1 billion. I mean, you never know. Just click the subscribe button. It could happen. All right. See you next. And until then, keep crafting.